Hey, folks, and welcome to Counterclipping show number 114 for March 6th, 2023. Actually, had 2323 in the notes. We're broadcasting from the future, apparently. So, our topic today is the war games that changed war games, those war games that are exceptionally transformative for the art of war game design and the player experience and any of a number of other reasons that we will explore. I will surely miss some, so I would love to hear your suggestions as we go through the list. And of course, I limited myself to a number of games that I felt I could get through in a 2-hour show, so bear that in mind as well. So it's not like we're going to catch absolutely everything that is influential in some way, right? We are drinking, I don't have the bottle within easy reach, but we are drinking Balvenie 12 Doublewood. This was the bottle that I procured for Winterfest, and somehow I managed to bring it home with about 2 grams left in it. So I don't believe we're going to kill it tonight, but it's very good, bottled at 43%. And I recommend trying it with and without water. I prefer it without water added. We are clipping 1914 Offensive à Outrance. And we've sort of done some camera rearranging here tonight, which may or may not be permanent. We will see, just because we are exploring a new OBS feature, new to me, OBS feature tonight, which you will see in the fullness of time. So I'd like to welcome everybody on board. Let me remind you that if you haven't already, please do like the video. Please do subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed. And if you'd like to help support the channel, other than those things which do support the channel, then please consider becoming a Patreon patron. There is a link to the Patreon in the video description. So before we get into all the business that we have today, and we've got some news to go through as well, let me give a big shout out to Bill Simoni, Block Oddity, Chad Kennedy, E4 Airman, Gary Theosophilis, George Hyotis. George, welcome back. HUN644, the legend himself, Fucko. Jeff Anderson, Jeff Beeler, Joe Okabayashi, John Longshore is in the house, John Stanley, John Clark, Lee Grant, Leslie Davis, Frank, it's Frank Davis, Manders, Mark G, Mark Hodgkinson, Marty Sample, Meandering Mike, Michael Simon, North Ranger, Paperless Writer, Pizza Frenzy Man, Ray Musselman, Rick Cox, Stacking Limit, also known as Andrew, Alistair. I'm screwing that up. Andrew Frankie. Stigler is in the house. Tim Greenhaw, Vicky, welcome back, and William Bird. And I know that I've missed a few people, including John C. from the sunny Philippines, so I apologize if I have missed anybody else. That is just the way YouTube wants to handle this stuff. So let me grab names out of the chat here that I haven't gotten yet. Jeff Beeler, if I didn't get to you, I think I did. I think I've got Rudy Armendariz is in the house. Didn't get you in the YouTube list. Charles Latora, Manders, Abraxas MF, and Daniel Brown. So everybody, welcome to the stream. So if you haven't seen it already, let me go through the things that we did last week here on the channel. We did, first of all, on Friday, the Harn World Kickstarter preview. We took a look at what you'll be getting in that Kickstarter, so check that out if that is of interest to you. We also did a video interview with Grant Douglas of Columbia Games last night, so check that out if that is of interest. But the big news, channel news, was the Big Ghosts of SPI show that we did last Thursday, and which, let's say, viewer feedback has been really, really positive. So obviously we're going to have to follow up on that. I would like to give a shout out to Frank Davis, who did the lion's share of the work in setting that up. I did some too, but everybody I contacted said, "Get out of here, kid, you bother me." So all the actual work that accomplished something was pretty much done by Frank on that. So but it was a really big success, and it's extremely encouraging to see the glowing user feedback from that. So we will look to a follow-up, which may not be the same format, but we are going to definitely try to organize a follow-up to that show, and we'll see exactly how that looks. We'll put all these in this same container. We'll see exactly what that looks like. We also did an unboxing of the new ASL product, Drop Zone St. Mary Glease. So check that out if you're interested in ASL. GDW would be great. I got probably I got some ideas on that, so that would be cool. Um, but we'll do what we can. We got to get all the people in the same room, and just getting 5 or 6 people in the same room at the same time is actually really difficult. So it's not like we could have repeat that once a week, but boy, that's good. Okay, so let's get to the wargaming news before we do anything else. Where is my screen with the wargaming news? So, Kickstarter that may be relevant. This is the Kickstarter for 85 Afghanistan Graveyard of Empires. This uses the same system as the other game, 65 Squad Battle. So, it's a squad level game set in Afghanistan. So, if this is of interest to you, do check it out. There's a link to this in the video description. So if you enjoyed the previous game, this might be something you want to take a look at. There are 2 new products on pre-order from Multi-Man Publishing, one of which is not really a new product. It's just another ASL product that was allowed to go out of print. This is a new printing of Armies of Oblivion. This is the Axis Miners. It is said to be identical to the previous edition, except that it will include the up-to-date rules pages, which you should already have if you're caught up on this stuff, I think. So if you already have this in a recent printing, one of the last 2 printings, I don't know that you need it again. I don't intend to pick this up again. But if you need Armies of Oblivion, then now's your chance. Also, ASL Journal number 14, which contains a whole bunch of scenarios. This is focused on Anzac action in the Second World War. So those interested in that topic specifically will be very excited about this. There is a historical campaign game in here as well. It is at a relatively steep price of $51, but it does also have a bunch of articles plus 24 scenarios, and 24 scenarios is not nothing. So plus a campaign game. So there is going to be a lot here. And for those who have a hope of actually playing any of this material, I would say you should absolutely, unless you're just, you don't want to deal with the Anzacs for some reason. If you have a hope of playing this material, then I would say go for this. I am waffling on it myself since funds are really tight right now. So let me drop this. We're going to try a couple other things here. So let me just kind of fill you in on what's going on. We do have the last Blitzkrieg game, which we intend to continue this week. That is Wednesday. So we're really enjoying that. The next big thing on my play docket is Lava Tide in Mont Saint Jean. That's going to get played in April at Buckeye Game Fest in Columbus, Ohio. Anyone interested in Buckeye Game Fest, please contact me. This reminds me to put the ticker up, which has my email address in it, plus a link to the Discord. If a refreshed link to the Discord, if you want to join the Ardwulf Lair Discord server, we are actually having regular conversations on there now, which is fantastic. So feel free to do that. That link will be good for 24 hours. I'd like to give a big shout out to new patrons, Jeff. We've screwed that up. Jeff Anderson and Rick Cox. Thank you very much for your support. It is much appreciated. And for those who didn't catch the 3D printing thing, if you have the ability to print 3D models, I'm making my STL files available to patrons at the swordsman level and above. That's the $5 level. So hopefully that'll help just drive more patrons, which is the best really way to support the channel. So the super chats and super stickers are obviously much appreciated, but Patreon takes a lot less than YouTube does of that stuff. So bear that in mind. And I didn't want to have turn the YouTube subscriptions on. Having like 2 parallel subscriptions seemed to be not a thing that I wanted to deal with. ASL Journal 14, John Longshore says, suggest purchasing from Ritterkrieg. I am not sure I bought anything from them before. I think I have. And it was certainly fast shipping. So I have no complaints on that score. And the price might be lower too. I have no idea. So the Lefranc Terreur ASL third-party material has a good reputation, unlike some producers of ASL third-party material, if you know who I'm talking about. So they might, some publishers roll the dice and get a critical miss. I'll just put it that way. Anyway, Six Actual, welcome back to the stream. A Crichtal, Daniel Silverthorne. I don't think this sim system is all that similar to Old School Tactical, but I could be wrong since I haven't played this. I have fooled with Old School Tactical, however, and it's pretty good. And it's, obviously the components are really really nice, and in general, the Mark Walker and company do a really really good job at components. Witness also the spectacularly nice Most Fearful Sacrifice. Um, the other thing I've been working on, I did a decent amount of this over the weekend, and this is so I set myself up to be delayed on putting the shelves up in the game room back there, right? Because I decided I think I'm going to spray paint this stuff, the shelves, because I couldn't get 15, 10 and a half foot boards in like the pre-finished, variety. So I had to I just bought 1x12s and was just going to sand them and spray paint them and all that stuff. And I did all that for about 4 shelves. And then the weather went bad and I can't do any of this in the house. Especially, I could have done the painting in the house, but I decided I was going to use spray paint because I thought that would be easier. It was not. I will not do spray paint in the future, but once I, started some of the shelves being spray painted, I had to continue with spray paint. So as of the end of the weekend, I have all of the shelves cut, sanded, and spray painted, and the last of them are on the wall drying for another day when I can start putting stuff on them. So pretty soon we're going to have a reorganization. So the shelves behind me here are probably going to change, but we'll see what that actually looks like when it comes up, and it's not going to come up probably for next week's show. So, but you'll see it when you see it, and there'll be a game room video and all that. But the first thing I got to do is get the shelves up so I can get all this crap that's just laying around right now off of whatever table it is sitting on. The table that you cannot see right here is littered with crap, for example, that there's just not really any place for. Jeff Beeler asks, what is the point of owning both DAC and DAC 2? Completionism is the really only point. If you have DAC 2, you should just be fine with that. If you have DAC 1, you should just play it with the DAC 2 rules and be fine with that. So, Stigler, thank you so much. Much appreciated. Excuse me. So I wasn't having this throatiness earlier, so of course, as soon as I start talking, that's probably why. These 3D printed bits trays, these you can just get on Thingiverse. You don't have to get these from me. Are fantastic and incredibly useful, and they have little pour spouts, so you could pour the chits right back into the baggie, which is where this thing is going right now. There'll be some kind of storage solution. This does not need 3D printed trays. I can get 3 trays in this box, no problem, maybe even 4. And that's more than adequate to organize this thing, even with the expansion. The expansion is not that big. All right, so new feature to the show and to me, but not to OBS, is the slideshow. So the first of the transformative war games that we're going to talk about, and I'm not going to say too much about this one because I'm on the record as saying this is a really important game in the history of commercial hex encounter or commercial board wargaming. It's literally the first one, but in part because it's not a historical topic. It's just kind of a made-up fantasy land with generic units. I don't consider it particularly interesting or particularly worth revisiting at this point. And you can go and pretty much get a similar experience out of a number of historical games that Avalon Hill did in starting with the next game that we'll talk about. And I'm guessing that a lot of folks can guess what the next game on the list is. We will be doing these in chronological order. And then at the end, we'll do some games that I think might prove to have a transformative effect on wargaming, but that have not been around long enough to say whether that's actually going to happen or not. So I have a couple of those. I have 28 games or something like that total, including the too soon to say games at the end. Tactics, obviously, is designed by Charlie Roberts, released in 1954. Obviously, hugely influential, birthed the entire hobby, but was swiftly followed up by a succession, many decades worth, in fact, of more interesting games. I don't consider the Avalon Hill Blitzkrieg, which is another early effort to be worthwhile or interesting nowadays, for exactly this reason. Jeff Beeler says, if you've played the war game, take a drink. That's actually a pretty awesome idea. So if anybody's, by the way, I'm not sure I got this out. If anybody's interested in coming to Buckeye Game Fest to do wargaming, we will be open Monday through Sunday, and there will be at least 2, and we think 3 tables of Labatai, plus a table of OCS, plus a bunch of other stuff. Guys from the Players Aid are going to be there. Brant from the Armchair Dragoons is going to be there doing stuff. So there's going to be plenty to do. If there is no sign up thing, however, that's meaningful in any way. So if you want to show up, just let me know. You can reach me at the email address in the ticker. Cardboard Conflicts, awesome. We'll be there on Wednesday. And a whole bunch of people. I have no idea what the train derailment problem in Ohio happens to be at this moment. That does seem weird. So, all right. So next up after tactics is Gettysburg. This is Gettysburg 58. And this is noteworthy, if nothing else, because it is the first historical board war game that's based on like an actual historical event or scenario. This is obviously a massively influential game. This thing was revised many times, sometimes significantly. And if you, unless you go out of your way to get the 58 version, you're going to get something different than this box. But this is the most influential one, and all of the other ones kind of were products of their time, right? Even if that time was like 64 or whenever the next version of this came out. So double blind flat top being played, not to my knowledge, but that would be awesome. You should run it. So hugely influential, very influential in that circle of wargamers that was around in the mid 60s. Those guys included a lot of people who later became very influential in war games. You do not have to build your own tables. There will be tables there. I think we'll have a problem if Stigler, if you know what I did this kind of on a lark. There's a scheme behind the names of the Patreon levels, and if you've played that game, you know what it is. And I probably would have done it differently if I were doing it again today. So not for that reason, but it's just I don't really do that much D&D content on this channel. So a call back to D&D and the names of the Patreon tiers seems like a missed opportunity now. All right, so next up, the cool thing about this slideshow feature is I have it set up to just be the arrow keys on the keyboard, and it actually works regardless of whether I have that window maximized or not. Number 3 is Bismarck. This is sort of the, as far as I'm aware, this is kind of like the first game with where you're searching for hidden stuff. Now, I think the first version of this, the German player literally has one piece, the actual Bismarck, that floats around. But there's like a search algorithm in here that I think makes it very interesting. And that's obviously an idea that we would revisit many, many, many times in future war games. From what I've seen of Bismarck, this is a 1962 release designed by Charles Roberts. The methodology seems pretty primitive in here, but the next game we'll see, it becomes much more sophisticated. This is Jutland from Jim Dunnigan, 1967 from Avalon Hill. Now, this is also a naval game, and frankly, I think this is most interesting because, so bear in mind that there's a couple different versions of Bismarck that differ significantly, right? Bismarck 62 is the one I pulled, but there's a second edition of Bismarck that I believe to be different enough that it almost sounds like a separate game. So number 4 is Jutland. This is a Jim Dunnigan design, nevertheless from Avalon Hill, and not something, obviously, given the year of publication, which is 1967, not something that was first filtered through SPI. This is basically a miniatures game, but it's produced as a board war game. I think that's very interesting. I think that if there's mechanical influence for naval stuff in board war gaming, it comes more from here than it does from Bismarck, I think. Bismarck, HUN 644 says Bismarck also inspired SSI's computer Bismarck. I'm sure that's true, but at the same time, that may well have been the later version of Bismarck too. So, and it's not like, we didn't know about the Bismarck. I mean, it did get its own song. So Jutland is a game you can actually see being better with miniatures. And the fact that you play it on a gymnasium floor, it's really kind of a miniatures game, whether there's miniatures in the box or there's a statement that says you should play with miniatures or not. So very interesting game. I think there's folks still playing this. I think this actually holds up very well, and is one of the earliest Avalon Hill games. Maybe not the earliest, but one of the earliest Avalon Hill games that I think you can say that about. Next up is obviously Panzer Blitz. Now, this started out as tactical game number 3 from SPI, and then it went to Avalon Hill in a somewhat revised version, and that became Panzer Blitz. And obviously, this is massively influential. However, I think folks are going to know Panzer Blitz, right? Panzer Blitz is the one that tons and tons and tons and tons of people played rather than Tactical Game 3, right? Which was, really back in the day at 1970, really back in the day when SPI was releasing prototypes rather than full games. I mean, it was literally like an experimental games series at the time. Ye old geezer gamer says that the difference there was the Bismarck was trying not to be found, and the two fleets at Jutland were trying to find each other. Yes, absolutely true. But oh yes, and Ed Holtzman mentioned Sabaton, of course, which is a band you should check out if you're into that kind of music. And yes, that is probably true. A lot of people entered wargaming via Panzer Blitz. This is a game with a very simple rule book. It's got one of those bed sheet style rule books where it's one big like trail map type thing that you fold out. I guess that's safe. They save money on staples or something like that. But it's the equivalent of like a 4 or 6 page rule book, maybe 8 pages or something like that. So it's really really simple. This is a game that I think is worth revisiting nowadays. Not only is it massively influential, without Panzer Blitz, you're not going to have Squad Leader, for example, which I won't surprise anybody by telling you that that will make an appearance later on this list. Um, I, to date, have still never played Panzer Blitz, by the way. I have it. It has passed through my hands a couple of times, and I have a copy now. And I probably will bust it out at some point to give it a whirl just to have had the experience. And it's not like it's going to take a whole week to play that. It's not. There's some fairly well documented holes in the system as well, which is why it changes to some extent when you later release Panzer Leader, which is sort of Panzer Blitz for the West Front, and then still later Arab-Israeli Wars, which is obviously Panzer Blitz for the Arab-Israeli Wars. But nevertheless, so at one point, to touch on John Clark's comment, um, at one point, and I believe by one point, we mean pre-Squad Leader, Panzer Blitz was the number one selling war game of all time. So yeah, lots of people played Panzer Blitz. Now, is this something that I would play on a regular basis today? No, it's not. But it's another one of those unplayed classics that I should probably revisit or visit, I suppose, since I've never played it before at some point, just so I can say that I've had the experience of playing Panzer Blitz. So it'll be hilarious to be playing Panzer Blitz for the first time in 2023. I do have a list, however, and Panzer Blitz is not at the top, and it's in fact not in the top 3. You'll see what has now become number 1 in the unboxing video in a week or 2. It's not this week's unboxing video. Okay, next up is Quebec 1759. So for those who watched the interview with Grant Douglas on Harnworld yesterday, an interesting thing that came up is possibly interesting to wargamers as well. This is a release from 1972, and BGG lists the credit as Tom Douglas, Lance Gooderidge, and Steve Brewster. And I don't have the book, and I couldn't find a PDF copy of the book to tell me. Stuka Joe, welcome to the stream. It's always good to have you here. Achilles, we could almost do that, actually. I'm not going to do it on this show, but doing it live is not that bad of an idea. It's not like it takes a long time to play or is super sluggishly paced, like frankly a lot of the stuff that I do play. So Quebec 1759 is the first block war game, and it was out of print for a long time, and was then brought back by Columbia Games. Now the factoid that I didn't know until Grant told me this is that Gamma 2 didn't change their name until 1983. I thought they changed their name in like 1975. So the later Columbia Games version of this is many years later, but this is super early. Now, block war games wouldn't really become a thing for quite a while, and this is the classic Columbia Games hidden block system where you stand the blocks up and there's a sticker or embossing or whatever on one side that you can see and your opponent can't, and then you can't see your opponent's numbers either. So there's a kind of fog of war built into it. It's nice and elegant. And if you think about it, blocks are really just really thick counters that you can stand up on their sides anyway. So I still consider this to be a counter-based war game, even if the counters are made of wood. So now, I cannot say that I am terribly interested in this particular topic. That said, and this is French and Indian War stuff, if I'm not mistaken. So, um, that said, this is a hugely influential game that spawned the entire. Everybody says that Stratego thing, and there's some truth to that. I'm not sure when Stratego came out. I'm pretty sure it predates this. So the original idea may well have come from Stratego, but we're not going to. I'm not going to allocate a slot to Stratego on this show. So this was first brought into like war games with Quebec 1759. It is more sophisticated than Stratego, to be less fatuous about it. There's kind of a lot that can be managed with the blocks and the block rotations and stuff like that. And a lot of that you see in later games. I believe Quebec 1759 has steps that are marked by rotating the blocks to various sides. Columbia Games has led the pack in this, or before them, Gamma 2 has led the pack in this field. One of their games, Napoleon, which I believe is it's kind of an operational Waterloo campaign game, actually was published by Avalon Hill for a while, and then Columbia got that back. How, I'm not sure. Could have just been a temporary license. They got that back, and they are publishing it again now themselves. Meandering Mike says, and I believe I've heard this before, Stratego is based on L'Attaque from 1909, which may have been a French game or something like that. There is a War of 1812 game that I believe to have been much later. However, I could be wrong. This is the original. The one you see here is the original Gamma 2 flat version. Flat meaning flat box, and it's a fairly flat box. If you want to see more on this specific game, Gilbert Collins has a couple of videos about it. So by all means, check that out. And frankly, this wasn't something that I think I didn't know this game was as old as it was until I watched Gilbert's video several years ago. So, all right, next up is Drang nach Osten. This is from Game Designers Workshop, 1973, designed by, at least according to BGG, designed by Frank Chadwick and Rich Banner. And I believe that to be a correct attestation in this particular case. This, of course, began the Europa series, which ultimately would turn into a whole pile of games, most of which I have at this point. But also is the first monster war game, as far as I can tell. Both La Bataille de la Moskva, which is also pretty big, and SPI's War in the East, which you'll see in a minute, came after this. This is the first monster war game, as far as I can tell. It is quite large. It is also quite different from its later incarnation of Fire in the East. Mechanically, the foundations are still the same. However, Fire in the East adds a lot, and obviously redoes the maps to bring them up to the amazing graphical standards of something like 1981. I've looked at this, and in fact, somewhere on a drive, I have a video of this that where I pawed through Fucko's copy, and it's real primitive looking. But I mean, this is like the first thing GDW did, or one of the first couple of things that GDW did, and it's 1973. So I mean, it's ugly, but I believe we do have to cut them some slack because it was 1973, right? They hadn't even discovered bell bottoms yet. They probably had in 1973, but they hadn't discovered disco yet. So Drang nach Osten, hugely influential. Every monster game or monster gamer knows, that this is the genesis of that end of the hobby, is right here. I think I said 1972. Didn't I say 1972 on Quebec 1759? I keep wanting to call it Quebec 1859, which is why I keep getting confused about whether it's part of the French and Indian Wars or not. Next up is, in fact, SPI's War in the East. Now, this is This cover is the first edition. The second edition cover is basically the same. So they released this in 1974. This is a Jim Dunnigan design, and it's got a bunch of really what were at the time really novel mechanics. The production spiral does show up in this first edition, and that is a thing that SPI would come back to, and several other companies have come back to. Most notably, World in Flames. World in Flames now has a production circle rather than a production spiral. I am reasonably sure that the production spiral was a Redmond Simonson innovation. I mean, we're talking about the dude who came up with the turn record track, for example. So that's just got the Redmond Simonson fingerprints all over it. So that it shows up later in War in Europe and in War Between the States is perhaps not surprising. Now, 2 years later, in 1976, they release a War in the East second edition, which is a significantly revised version of the game. With like, the maps aren't only different, they're different, right? I mean, there's like terrain on them. And it's a different map. I believe it's a different projection, but it's definitely a different physical map layout. They also released War in the West, and then it was part of War in Europe. And I was going to put War in Europe on this list, but then it seemed like I should go back to War in the East instead. So I have War in the East second edition as part of War in Europe. So in 1976, they released 2 years after this, they released a second edition, War in the East, which, as I said, is a significant revision, along with War in the West. And then I think the same year they released the whole thing in a giant Mondo package called War in Europe, which did come out in both the flat tray and the big soapbox. And I think the soapbox might have been a couple of years later. I'm not sure I have that information, but it was definitely available in both formats, both flat pack and the soapbox. And I've played War in Europe, and it's pretty good. And it's pretty easy to play for what it is. It does, however, as I think anybody that's played War in Europe will admit, have some issues. It's got some balance issues, it's got some exploit issues, and it's got some aesthetic issues that I think are undesirable, that are artifacts of its scale. The units are divisions. The hexes, I believe, are 20 miles to the hex. And that combined with the stacking limit in an effort to make the frontage somewhat historical, you end up, particularly in the East Front, but this happens elsewhere too, with like 6 hex deep lines, and it feels really artificial and goofy. And I think that doesn't particularly work. Now, Fucko, I'm looking at I looked at pictures. That's how I figured that out. That the first edition had the production spiral. So maybe that's wrong. Maybe the pictures led me astray. But as far as I can tell, I thought that the first edition had it. Now the second edition definitely does, because it's in War in Europe. But interestingly, the production system that you use between the Germans and the Russians is not the production system that you use between the Germans and the Western Allies. So the Soviets and the Germans use the production circle, and the Western Allies are just on a reinforcement schedule. It's weird. And I think that's one of the changes that they made in Decision's version of War in Europe, which I would kind of like to see, but I'm certainly not going to pay $500 or $600 to take a look at it. Not when I have the original game, and I don't believe the Decision version to be a huge revision, but they did change some stuff. They've been talking about doing it again for years, and I don't know if that's actually going to happen. William Bird, first game to get away from the IGO-UGO structure. We're going to probably hit 1 or 2 of those here, but not quite yet. And I'm kind of tracing these as from like a mechanical standpoint, and it's very plausible that I have missed some, and I know I'm not covering all the various mechanics. All right, so next up is Invasion America. Now, as was pointed out to me pretty recently, and it was on a live stream, and I'm not sure where. This came out the same year as Panzergruppe Guderian, and the really interesting, a number of other things are interesting about Panzergruppe Guderian too, but one of the things that people point out is the untested or untried units, and that actually first appeared here in Invasion America. This came out first. It's not really possible to tell that from the BGG listing, but apparently that is the case. So all of those games that later used untried units and or any of the variations thereof, as this mechanical idea evolved. So it goes to Panzergruppe Guderian. It later goes to Operation Typhoon, right behind me. Later goes to Victory in the West games. Later on, that becomes the variable combat series and the system that New England Simulations has done a couple of times now. I'm actually done clip encounters. I went through those very quickly. There was only about a sheet there. New England Simulations has done a couple of games using that system or thereabouts. Greg Blanchett over at Compass has done 2 games, Fallblau and Kharkov Battles, and has at least one more in the works using that what's now called the variable strength system. Now, later incarnations of that idea are somewhat different, where you're actually drawing a variable strength chit and keeping it under the unit. I have seen a couple of other variations on the idea where you actually roll the variable strength every time the unit enters combat. That's very interesting, and I'm not sure that would. I mean, that may be one of those ideas that's like, man, I don't know if this is going to work. This doesn't smell right to me. And then you play it and it might work. I don't know. But Ted Racer's Fall of the Third Reich is like that. You actually roll some of the unit strengths randomly. So people appear to like that mechanism. That has been an enduring mechanism in war games. I should have trimmed my nose hair before the show. And you didn't stop by to hear about that, I hope. But this has obviously been a very influential mechanical idea. And well, I think if you look at the whole game, I think Panzergruppe Guderian is more influential. But part of that is the fact that it went over to Avalon Hill and stayed. It got a lavish edition, lavish at the time, and stayed in print for a long time. Um, so we were Stacking Limit. We were at Winter Fest. Winter Offensive is a different event. Winter Fest is a sort of club con in Sandusky, Ohio. Winter Winter Fest is the club con in Sandusky, Ohio. Winter Offensive is MMP's convention over MLK weekend, and I was not at that. I was at the Armchair Dragoons digital convention instead. You're welcome, Brant. All right, next up is Terrible Swift Sword. This is our first of, I think, 2 entries from legendary late designer Richard Berg. This is a monster game of Gettysburg and is the genesis of the great Battles of the American Civil War system. Now, this evolved a bit too over these first couple of things, right? It's a bit different in TSS. It's a bit different in Bloody April. It's a bit different in Stonewall. And then I think by the time you get into games like Cedar Mountain and Pea Ridge and stuff like that, the system had kind of coalesced into a more or less consistent thing, at least, for the duration of its tenure at SPI. And later on with TSR as well. I'm not sure if 3W did a release in GBACW. Stigler would know, though. But TSR did. They did at least 1 and maybe 2 games that came out in strategy and tactics in the post SPI era. Maybe I should punch the rest of these. There's these expansion counters that I guess I can just put them by themselves. So John C., thank you so much. Much appreciated. Obviously, we will be talking about the CDG mechanism too. But hopefully we're showing people some other. I think everybody knows about the CDG thing, and it was hugely influential at this point. Alan Salazar, thank you so much. Much appreciated. It had very little to do with me. It is, I'm folks noticed that I hardly did any talking the whole time. I was like, I'm good. Yep. Maybe I'll ask a question occasionally or make a wisecrack, but yep, I'm pretty much going to let these fine individuals talk and let them drive the tempo here. So it was at the same, it was stressful to do because you're this is an intimidating crowd, right? But it was in another sense extremely easy to moderate because I didn't have to do anything. I just sat there and they talked about SPI and I mean we could totally do that again. I think people would be happy to watch another 2 hours on that. So Turbo Swift Sword. This is might be the first game where you like track unit hits on a record track. GBACW still has that, but they have counters for it now. A lot of people like this was a first monster game for a lot of people, and it looks pretty good for its age, right? This is a Um, where's my note on this? This is a 1976 release. So it's it's not bad looking for a 1976 game by any means. And it's certainly better looking than the TSR version. Now there's a reason to get the TSR version rather than the SPI version, however. And they're basically the same game. I'm aware of no significant revisions to the TSR version of the game, other than that they made the map ugly and they gave the counters center nibs. But the other thing is that TSR did a later game called Rebel Sabers, which is Civil War cavalry battles. But it also gives you a whole map and a scenario over on which you can play out that whole Eastern Cavalry action at Gettysburg. So it links up to their version of Terrible Swift Sword. I guess you could do that with the SPI version, but you'd have like TSR maps and SPI maps, and a black hole might erupt if you want to put the two together. I would advise against it. So at least the whole thing will be consistently ugly if you have the TSR Terrible Swift Sword. I'll also mention, I suppose, that I consider this to be one of the best titles in the history of war games. This is a great title. Everybody knows exactly what it's about. Just from the title, it is evocative without calling, without the name being Gettysburg this or Gettysburg that, right? There are many examples, many recently, of games with what I think are not good titles, even though the games might be really good. One is Fire in the Lake. That title means I know there's a book called Fire in the Lake about Vietnam, but I didn't know that at the time. So that does not leap out at me that this is a Vietnam game. Now, if you see the box, it totally does, but the title does not. So sorry, Volko. And Mark, actually, I don't think that's a great title for a game. I understand that the book is important to the design and to the approach, I suppose. But I felt like I'm not like a complete knob, and that the title was unfamiliar to me. Where Terrible Swift Sword was like, well, I know what that's about, right? So, and every American should know what that's about. Um, so Graffiti's Albion says that it's hard to believe that the TSS system eventually evolved into the current GB ACW system. I suppose so. I mean, they're obviously quite different, but I mean, I don't think it's a nonsensical. I don't think it's a like first principles redesign or anything like that. I mean, I think there's an evolution to be seen there, but the systems are very different. Um, there's not really like a missing link in there either. I thought there was, and that turns out I think that's not the case. Where there's like an intermediate game in between the old GBACW and the new GBACW. I think there's not, but you do see signs of that in things like Dead of Winter for the first version of that from Simulations Design, for example. As Stigler points out, there are now 8 battles that are rendered in both systems, and one of the things I would like to do, since I have all of the GMT games and a decent chunk of the SPI games, is to play out the same battle in both games and see, kind of to have a really good sense of what the differences are, and then make a video about that. I think that would be cool content. And it's just a matter of getting the time to do that. I keep saying that Cedar Mountain is the battle to do that, but the more I think about it, the right battle might be Kernstown because it's smaller. But Stonewall, that the first Kernstown in the SPI days, I think does have some significant differences even from the regular SPI version of the battle and or the system. And it's a really small game. There's like 30 or 40 counters in that. All right. And Holtzman says that Berg was Captain Chrome, and some people love that. Um, I mean, certainly that's the reputation. I think that's less true than some people think. But I mean, it did happen too, right? I don't think you can deny that. I think GBACW Stigler is you're gonna get some fisticuffs out of Stigler if you keep this up. But I think it is pretty chromy. But I don't think it's unnecessary chrome. Now, are you as a player or am I as a player willing to deal with that level of detail? Maybe not, and that's completely fair statement. But GBACW has really taken off in the last couple of years. There's a lot of people playing and enjoying that system, and I think that says something. It's not a game that which one will get to is a game that sat on shelves for many, many, many years. Is it next? I don't think it is. Nope. Next up is Squad Leader, John Hill, 1977. Obviously, this is an ASL is not on this list, by the way. Obviously, it's been a hugely influential game, but it wouldn't have been hugely influential if it didn't have Squad Leader to start with. Um, Kind of all of the wargaming buttons get pushed in Squad Leader, right? You've got some mechanics that a lot of people hadn't seen before with morale and losing control of your troops. That is a thing, and that's going to be true of a number of these mechanical innovations. These are the games that brought some of these ideas to board wargaming. Some of these ideas had been floating around in miniatures gaming prior to that, and I'm not shocking anybody by saying that some of these guys might actually have played a miniatures game or two as well. Just occurred to me that I didn't turn the ring light on, but I guess it's too late now, and I guess the lighting looks okay. Um, Jack Stalika says that Berg is the worst thing that ever happened to gaming, not an exaggeration. I mean, he was a divisive figure, there's no doubt about that. I don't agree, but I am also not going to tell you that his influence was entirely, as a designer, his influence was entirely positive, and I'm certainly not going to tell you there are no misfires in the Richard Berg catalog. There totally are. So as long as we're polite, I am happy to have that discussion happen in the chat. Um, so I probably look I don't know, whiter, I guess, in the with the ring light on. So Berg did some simple and elegant designs as well. Um, but his best known designs do tend to be bloated and chromy. And sometimes he had a propensity as a designer to kind of disappear into his own chrome, shall we say. There's a less polite to way to put that. Someone should totally make a game about this. I would feel obliged to buy that actually, since the Cuyahoga River runs not far from here. And it was they made a song about it. Burn on, Big River, burn on. So there's that. And there's an excellent pale ale out of Cleveland called Burning River Pale Ale. So Squad Leader, obviously very influential. This is one of those games that, it and its descendant that's still around, Advanced Squad Leader, is so popular that it's got kind of its own parallel wargaming community, many of whose members, not everybody obviously, but there's people in that community that don't really have anything to do with the rest of wargaming. They're just ASL people, and that's it. There has been talk. So Perfidious Albion says that there's a simple Great Battles of History, which is another Richard Berg co-designed. That's sort of, but he doesn't think there was a simple version of the Civil War battle system, by which I believe we mean GBACW. And that's true. However, there has been talk about that, and if they would like to do that, I would be happy to check it out. I am not a huge fan of simple GBOH. I don't think that simple GBOH is that much simpler than regular GBOH, and I think you lose a lot of detail. There are still reasons to prefer it, but those are reasons that are not important to me. So, and Stigler says simpleton rules for GBACW. So apparently something's doing that. Mike, I would totally watch this. So yes, by all means do that. Mr. Mike here is a big Richard Berg aficionado, and I believe has a complete or near complete collection of Richard Berg's games. And that's a lot of games. I looked at his BGG list again. He's got like 300. I don't forget what the actual number is, but it's a lot. Lot of games, very prolific designer, maybe the most prolific designer in the history of wargaming. The only person I can think of that might be able to rival that is Jim Dunnigan. And Jim Dunnigan has been out of the wargaming design space for a long time now, right? So Pizza Frenzy Man has banned ASL. So, and I also sympathize with the folks who say, I just don't want to deal with that, whether that is the complexity of it or that is the community and we'll say cliquishness. I think that's a polite way to put it. I think we can agree that that is a phenomenon that we do see in the ASL community. Although, not certainly not everybody. I mean, when I just rando shows up with a camera at ASL Oktoberfest, there were a couple of people that did talk to me, just not any of the people running the event. They ignored me, even though I stood there at the desk wanting to just tell them I was there and I just was there to take some pictures, blah 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 blah. And they studiously ignored me the whole time. And I said, okay. After 10 minutes, I just wandered off and took some pictures and was there for 40 minutes total or something like that. So Aaron Dennis says that the great thing about Chrome is that you can use it as you see fit based on your appetite for such things, as long as the game doesn't rely on Chrome to function properly. A lot of games do rely on the Chrome, though, or the Chrome gets in the way, or the Chrome is not modular in the sense that you could just kind of, well, we'll just ignore this rule that we think is just too much. We will do a show on Richard Berg. So at some point, and in fact, is that actually on the list? And we're not going to talk about Berg personally because I didn't know him. If we were going to have a discussion about Richard Berg personally, I'd have somebody on who knew him, um, and we'd talk about that. That would be a show that's worth doing, by the way. But that is, a best of Richard Berg show is now scheduled for March 27th. Congratulations. We're doing it live here on the air. I did not do a show on Berg. I mean, not, it wasn't called that anyway. I've certainly talked about Berg a fair amount. All right, skipping back forward. This is the problem, is when I use the arrow keys. Next up is Flat Top. I felt I needed to include an S. Craig Taylor thing here, and my excuse for including this is obviously it's one of my favorite games. It's probably my favorite Avalon Hill game at this point. It is very much paperwork in the Pacific. If you don't like paperwork, you are not going to have a good time playing Flat Top, even if you're playing it double blind with a moderator. Oh yes, I forgot to mention this. As Doug Blayart mentions, there are now rules for cows in ASL. So you could take the cows to find the minefields. We needed a rule for that. Anyway, there's an enormous amount. So on the one, so ASL and Chrome is a bit of an odd duck. Okay. On the one hand, there's no denying that there's an enormous amount of Chrome there. There really is. However, the Chrome is modular, right? You don't have to play the scenario with the cows. You don't have to play the night scenarios or the airdrop scenarios or the scenarios with the caves. You can just have squads and some leaders and some machine guns and maybe some demo charges. There's tons of scenarios for that. So while yes, there's a lot of Chrome in ASL, a lot of it is ignorable based on scenario selection. So there should be a special cow tipping mechanic, I believe. Yeah, so this is true to a point. Some of those scenarios take longer to play than they should. Some of them don't, but a lot of the scenarios that don't are like the first couple, right? The one of the weaknesses of the squad leader box itself as like a complete package is actually the programmed instruction. Also a strength of the package, right? Because you work your way up to knowing all the rules, and you can only play the last couple of scenarios that use all those rules. So and then you were reliant on wherever they put the extra scenarios, which at the time you could occasionally get a scenario in the general. I think back in the day they didn't have them in every issue. At one point, it was in every, you did get like 2 in every issue. But not at first. So you had to buy things like Cross of Iron and Crescendo of Doom, and then added more stuff and more Chrome. And then, yes, you could ignore that, but you really wanted the extra scenarios. Now that's not really a concern. You could just go buy a couple action packs, and yeah, you might not be able to play every scenario in the action pack, but you're probably okay for some of them, as long as you picked it correctly based on what you actually have. And kind of pick and choose. One of the things that drives my ASL purchases nowadays is scenarios, just because I want the scenarios. Um, So flat top though, let's get back to flat top. So I felt like I needed to include a game from the late great S. Craig Taylor, and I picked this. It was pretty much going to be this or maybe Wooden Ships and Iron Men. But I think that Wooden Ships and Iron Men, although it's probably the best executed game of its kind, there are a number of games of its kind, and there's not that much stuff like Flat Top. So in here, you have a lot of the tools that you would get in a double blind refereed experience, except that that experience is managed via paperwork rather than through having an actual referee. ASL does have a DIY scenario generator, and I believe some of the solitaire stuff is somewhat random as well. Um, so as far as I know, I mean, where are you going to draw the line, right? If Twilight Struggle's a war game, then maybe Twilight Struggle's the most popular war game. I don't know, but there's certainly a lot more people playing ASL regularly than I think Twilight Struggle at this point. So definitely need water here. Flat Top does play very well over Vassal because you got to plot everything in advance too. So you don't have to plot everything, but there's a lot that you do have to plot in advance. So it is. It occurs to me that I should have decided I was playing the one of the surface fleets this time rather than playing the air one of some of the air assets. Was ASL ASL's not on the list. Squad leader is. I think squad leader is transformative, even if that transformation results in a walled garden off in one corner of wargaming at some point. And as John C points out, Vassal started out as virtual ASL, right? So we would not have Vassal if it were not for ASL. But I didn't feel like duplicating efforts and putting both squad leader and ASL on here. I think the mechanical innovations all happen with squad leader, and sort of the community impact is probably bigger for ASL. And we can talk about, and this would be another halfway decent topic to just explore at some point, is playing war games competitively, right? That is a something that I don't tend to do. And by tend to do, I mean I just don't. I'm not that kind of player. And yes, Stigler had transformed them into burning wreckage. And every time we've played it, it has always ended with Japanese carriers in flames. Sometimes we end up with an American carrier in flames as well, but the Japanese carriers always seem to end those scenarios in flames. Stigler points out that Flat Top has a ton of admin work. Yes, that's what I mean by paperwork. There's a lot. I mean, it's a lot. It's I don't think it's the heaviest paperwork war game. That'd probably be Federation and Empire, but it is absolutely a very paperwork intensive war game. And as I said, if you don't like that, you are not going to have a good time playing Flat Top. So, but again, you've got all that double blind elements to it that you ordinarily would otherwise need a referee for. Next up is one of the examples. This is our second Richard Berg entry. And this is really, I think, been an instructive and an influential game in a backhanded way, in that this is held up as one of the things you should not do as a designer, is design the campaign for North Africa. Now, I haven't played this. This also has a lot of administrative paperwork to be done in it. And I suspect, and people that are playing it now have told me this, um, that it plays a lot better if you have a laptop there with running Excel and can use Excel to manage all the paperwork. I have no doubt that that is an accurate statement. But in when did this come out? 1978, 1979. They didn't have laptops or Excel, so you had to do it all manually. And the buzz on the street is that nobody ever played this, and I think that's not accurate. And certainly there are people that have played it, and there frankly are people playing this now. The footprint for Campaign for North Africa, I don't know that it's exactly the same, but it is very similar to DAC or DAC 2. The footprint of DAC and DAC 2 is identical. Um, So I think it was Paul Koenig actually set this up, not set the whole game up, but laid the maps out on a table at Compass Expo. And this is a pretty late SPI game, but it looks good. I mean, I think this thing looks good even today. The counters are, they look like SPI counters, but they're nice. The maps look nice. This is a quite attractive game, I think, even today. And frankly, that's art, not graphic design. But all the Redmond Simonson graphic design hallmarks are in there as well. So the yes, Rudy Armendariz, as mentioned, this got showcased as a dorky thing that Sheldon was playing on the Big Bang Theory, and I've watched that episode. And I haven't seen a lot of the Big Bang Theory, but I've seen several episodes, including that one. I went out of my way to watch that one, and um, clearly there were some people. Somebody in the writing room was in on the joke. Let me put it that way. But I don't recall that they mentioned the pasta rule. I don't know if any actual Italians were angered by that, but um, I mean that was the running joke, right? Was the Italian pasta rule. So Sagacious Hamster, I think you're right. They recommended like 10 players per side. And that was really the only way you could like make it run sort of smoothly. Except that in no sense does this thing but does North Africa. This is the Western Desert, right? In no sense does this split sensibly into 5-player teams. So 2-player teams maybe, but I mean there's no natural divide here. So this is Jeff Beeler says he almost bought CNA but passed it up for Battles for the Ardennes instead. Much better value for money for him, and yeah, I think that's fair. So this is kind of a negative example, right? This is in part a result of Berg's reputation for mechanical excess, and in part the cause of Berg's reputation for mechanical excess, because it was never more obviously in evidence than it was here. Now, in his later years, Berg maintained that this was done for the purposes of satire, and I think that's would have been in character for Berg, but I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. I'm not saying that there weren't some elements of, oh, why not put this in there too, such and such the pasta rule, because we're covering everything else. I mean, maybe there's aspects of that, but I in no sense think that this thing was designed to be unplayable. But even SPI's marketing for this, like if you look at the ads, it's like the ultimate numerical simulation of the North African campaign. I mean, they were clearly positioning this as a serious simulation rather than as an enjoyable recreational pastime. And I think that's fine. And there are people who absolutely want want more. Give me more simulation. But the more simulation they want, the smaller the audience is for what it is that they're going to get. So this, other than the absolutely batshit prices that this thing goes for, I'm in the market for a copy, by the way, but I'm not going to pay even $300 for it. It would be. I'm only missing 2 of the SPI soapboxes that are World War II soapboxes, Wacht am Rhein and this. So if I see a copy for a price I feel like paying, I will buy this, and I would consider doing something with it. But I'm also not willing to pay anything remotely resembling the going price for this fucker. In no way. All right. So next up is the first thing that we've hit that's not. Yes. Okay. So this is the first 1980s game that we're going to hit here. How are we doing on time? We're doing excellent on time. And that's a very fast counter sheet and a half, by the way. So the Civil War by Eric Lee Smith. This is a great game. There's a playthrough series of me and Pat Mullen playing this back a couple of years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago. It actually watches, unlike a lot of like gameplay videos for the kinds of games I like to play, which make absolutely horrifically bad content. This actually flows fairly well. The really interesting thing is sort of the pulse-based movement system where you're kind of rolling and getting points and then spending the points to do activations, and then you can get more points. And then if certain conditions happen, then the turn ends. This is, I think, the first game in, unless Campaign for North Africa works differently than I think it does. And Flat Top is kind of the same way too. Actually, it's not strictly I go, you go. It's kind of we're all going together, and then we all kind of play it out and see what happens. Um, but this is like the first like tempo based uh deviation that we've had here tonight from the I go you go formula, right? You go and then I go and then you go and then I go, but they're very fast pulses rather than okay, I'm going to take a break, I'll be back. Um, which is a thing that one sees in a lot of games of this depth. Now, you could play this in a weekend. It's not an incredibly long playing game. I would estimate play time between 15 and 25 hours for this, depending on how far you get into the war and whether somebody feels like conceding or not when Grant gets killed on turn 2. That could happen, as in it happened to me in the game that is the playthrough. Later on, Robert E. Lee gets killed because Pat sent him out west and rolled one bad die too many, and Robert E. Lee got killed as well. So it was pretty much Stonewall Jackson versus for the Confederates and Lyon and Sherman, who Lyon survived, versus Stonewall Jackson. So it was an interesting game. There's obviously this is hugely influential. There are still many Civil War games after this take their beats from this game. Those include For the People, the U.S. Civil War. Both games learn a lot from this. Now you can look at this and then look back at SPI's War Between the States and see where the Eric Lee Smith borrows or is inspired by stuff from War Between the States in this game as well. These games don't just like arise out of the ether, right? I mean, out of just sheer power of genius of the designer. Although, if we're going to say, an interesting show topic would be the geniuses of wargaming, right? And if there's 2 games that I think justify that title for Eric Lee Smith, and this is one of them. It's also a great game that I think holds up fairly well. I do think it takes longer to play than is strictly desirable nowadays. But it is nevertheless a very good game and is absolutely worth your time. And there are absolutely reasons to prefer it over U.S. Civil War by Mark Simonich. The big one of those reasons, there's basically 2, right? I have conflicting opinions on the 2 games, right? I generally prefer U.S. Civil War because I think it does a lot of the lift that Civil War does without nearly as much mechanical overhead, and it's a lot faster playing. But there are 2 things that it leaves out that some people might say I would rather play the Eric Lee Smith Civil War because of them. One is that it leaves out all that stuff in the West. Now, even in the Victory Games Civil War, the Western map is optional. And we're not talking about the Western theater. We're talking about like deep trans-Mississippi and Oklahoma and shit. That is not, I think, particularly important to the Civil War. And even Eric Lee Smith apparently agreed because it's optional. You need the map because it's got all the tracks on it, but you don't really need to be playing out that part of the war. That's just going to slow things down. There's also the way the leaders work. And again, I understand that I generally prefer the leader schedule from U.S. Civil War. However, I would have preferred an optional rule that has the dynamic leaders where they can get killed and get promoted and stuff like that, like the Civil War has. That leads to a very dramatic and dynamic narrative, I think. And I miss that playing U.S. Civil War, even though I understand the reasons why it's designed the way it is, and I don't even disagree with those reasons. But I would love to be able to play it occasionally with the dynamic leader system like the Civil War has. So this is fabulous, fabulous. I don't want to call it, John C., I don't want to call it an expansion because it's in the box, right? It's just, it's the extra map. And it is, I believe, called the Far West map. So Yes, but the genesis of that idea is this game, the Civil War, right? Um, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we go here, because now we're starting to break away from that traditional I go you go narrative. It is very different. It is interesting, but it is not impactful on the normal course of the war, and I think is a sideshow if you're just trying to get the Civil War played out. I like having it as an option. Don't get me wrong, but and it is an option in this game. But I can also live without it. Um, so there are also I will point out that there's also an optional leader system for this game that even leads to like unknown leaders. You literally don't know who you have. So there's some truth to this. But there's also other ways to handle leaders like McClellan, and something like for the people does that, right? Where you could fire McClellan, but there is a political cost for doing so. That kind of thing. Well, I totally understand because in the victory game of Civil War, Grant arrives on turn 2, and I killed him on turn 2. So it can absolutely happen. So Jack Stalika says Eric Lee Smith is in the pantheon of playable master designers. Really? We'll get to this. We'll get to this. Let me get to the next game. And here it is, Panzer Command. This is the genesis of chit pull in board war games. I'm told that there were similar mechanisms being used in miniatures prior to this. That's going to be true of a lot of these things. Again, these ideas don't just pop up like the Big Bang. Arise from previous influences. Um, there are some favorites of mine, by the way. I'll talk about this in a second. That aren't on this list because I don't think they were influential. And Empires of the Middle Ages is one of those things. There's still not much like Empires of the Middle Ages. I think people didn't know what to make of Empires of the Middle Ages. There's still nothing like Outreach. But Panzer Command. So this is if you've played GTS, although the combat system is somewhat different in Panzer Command, the chit pull mechanism and the points economy that drives the chit pull system is basically taken directly from Panzer Command. The scale is roughly the same, except it's East Front, obviously. This I think is a game that yes, Stigler. I think this is a game that gets overlooked a lot because I don't know that it's necessarily that engaging as a game, but first chit pull game, right? That's huge. There's been tons of chit pull games since then. So Mo from Mo's Game Table is here. Mo, welcome to the stream. Always great to have you here. Um, this is absolutely true. And that's one of the reasons why I'd love to have an optional dynamic leader system in U.S. Civil War. Even though, like I said, I'd be happy to play it most of the time with the schedule. I am totally fine with that, but I'd rather have the option. I'd rather have the option to have the Far West as well. And in fact, if Mark Simonich, Mark, if you're watching, would like to do a U.S. Civil War expansion kit with a Far West map and a dynamic leader system, I would be buying it just like that. So I would be delighted to buy that. This is of course true. John Stanley says that leaders are variable in real life. Grant does great fighting at Forts Henry and Donelson, and then 2 months later gets surprised and gets nearly pushed into the Tennessee River at Shiloh. And yeah, obviously that's quite correct. But that's what the dice are there for too, right? The dice are giving you that variability. If I, as Grant, shit my pants rolling at Shiloh, well, then that's what's going to happen. Where I rolled great at Forts Henry and Donelson. So Panzer Command is a game I've leafed through it because after finding out how important it is, but I've never played nor ever owned. So, and Stigler says that Jackson, his record was incredibly spotty. This is completely true. Jackson was very erratic. And that's kind of a problem in the victory game of Civil War, because if you keep promoting him, and some of the leaders like John Bell Hood are very good at a certain level, and then if you promote them beyond that level, they become rather shitty. Stonewall Jackson remains really good the whole time, And I don't know that I think that's necessarily an accurate assessment of Stonewall Jackson. But again, he got killed, so we can't really say. Um, in his role in Independent Command in the Shenandoah, he did really good. So, but he was erratic. Anyway, next up in their quiet fields, Antietam. I actually had Thunder at the Crossroads listed here, and then I actually looked it up to realize that that's not the first game in this series. This is the Civil War Brigade series from the gamers and designer Dean Essig. And this it has been, Dean is another one of these playability focused designers, right? I mean, a lot of people don't like to deal with some of the minutia of OCS, but OCS is designed to be playable. And frankly, I think the evidence that there's tons of people playing it is evidence that Dean hit the mark on that, right? Even though it's pretty fussy, right? The unique innovate, not really unique, but the big paradigm shift here is the written orders. And I'm not sure if they were optional back at this point. They are optional in line of battle now. This is actually a great idea. Stigler says have 5 different Stonewall Jackson counters with radically different numbers, and you draw one every time he gets into a fight. And I guess you need a 6th one to represent him moving around on the map. That's not a bad idea, actually. Angola is one that's not on this list, and maybe should be. Actually, thinking about it. This is one of the games that launched the gamers as a thing as well. I'm not sure if this was their first release, but it was real close. And that has created its own kind of methodology inside wargaming, right? Is the sort of the Dean Essig signature designed for effect, and the various design quirks that seem to be common to Dean's games. Tremendous mechanical innovation. It's not the last time we'll be seeing Dean on this list either. But I wanted to include this series because of the written orders system. Now there is, of course, a similar but not the same written orders-esque thing in the Tactical Combat series as well. That uses what's called an op sheet, which is like a mini map where you actually draw the orders out, so you don't have to write and I say that you flourishedly write your orders in your best Virginia drawl. I think that's kind of cool in the Civil War stuff. In TCS, you don't do that; you just kind of draw it out on the map. But it's the same idea, right? And as I've said before, when these games came out, I never owned this. I never owned a CWB game until In Their Quiet Fields 2, actually. And that I got years after it released. But when I first saw TCS, which I want to say was in GD40, I think is the game that I had back in the day. I was like, whoa, this is weird. I mean, I had Guderian's Blitzkrieg and Enemy at the Gates as well. And I said, whoa, this is weird. You got to have supply points and you got to spend your supply points to do stuff. And there's markers for them. Wow, that's weird. I don't like that. And now I think these are wonderful things. Certainly there are things to be said against the supply point economy in OCS. And I think Dean heard those things, and that's why we have BCS. That's one reason why parts of BCS works the way it does. The Tabletop's Edge, welcome back to the stream. Thanks for stopping by. It's always great to have you here. Does not work in practice. Too much room for interpretation, even between like-minded players. This is absolutely true. But that's great. It's great. Now, I mean, does that mean that you are never going to play with written orders at like a tournament? Yes, frankly, it is. You need not just like-minded players, but players who are kind of approaching the game that you're playing with the same degree of collegiality that you are. If it doesn't sync like that, then those rules are best ignored. So we kind of Bob Kowalczyk, thank you very much. Much appreciated. I appreciate the support and thank you. Not to get ahead, but are we going to talk about pre-plotted movement a la FFW? I assume you mean Fifth Frontier War. We have already talked about pre-plotted movement because we covered Flat Top. which pre-plots a lot, but not everything, but it pre-plots a lot. So you know, yeah, kind of. We kind of already covered that. I didn't talk about the mechanism in detail. If I was going to do that, I would probably choose a purer example of that. And for me, of the games I've personally experienced, I think that game would be Star Force, SPI's Star Force, designed by Redmond Simonson, by the way. Very interesting, sort of speculative future history. And then designer asked, what does warfare look like in this speculative future history? And it's a serious exploration of that. The future history is kind of weird, but it's nevertheless a serious exploration of that. And it's a fascinating game more than it is a fun game to play, I would say. Um, the Tabletop's Edge says the epiphany in OCS is the action rating mechanic rather than the supply system. Not just action rating, but surprise. And action ratings effect on surprise, I think, is the really important thing, because it means that you can. Another component of that, though, is the fog of war rule, where you can't examine the other people's stacks. I mean, we're playing Europa, and I'm sitting there calculating the odds out to the last point, right? Because I know he's got 17 factors in that stack, and I know I need a 4-to-1, blah, 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 blah. So I put exactly the number of factors I need on that stack, and maybe a few extra air points for good measure. You can't do that in OCS, right? And I've told the story before where we have an opponent, and Fucko will know exactly who I'm talking about, who loves to break you, and you can do this as the German. No line is impregnable in OCS. Who loves to bust around and jump on your artillery units sitting behind your lines. All you got to do is put a tank corps under one of those, right? Tank corps in combat mode. Put that juicy artillery unit right on top. Put the Katushka, the 84 factor or whatever it is, the 120 factor Katushka right on top. Let him do it. He's going to get a big surprise when the action rating on that unit is a lot more than what it would be for just the artillery unit. So yeah, I mean that is a huge thing, but that is a more subtle effect than I think the supply is, which the supply you have to deal with immediately, right? Garrison Ben, thank you so much appreciated. I appreciate the support. Is everybody doing okay on this? All right, John Stanley's talking about Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. I think you can't really deny, and I think Stonewall Jackson was a certifiable nut, but his performance in the Valley campaign was very good. Perfidious Albion. This is actually the rule that Doug and I are talking about. This is one of the best features of OCS, I think, is that unpredictability. You want to put in, and bear in mind, you're not only committing forces to the attack, you're committing supply too, right? And you have to be careful. It's a decision that you have to make. How much supply, how many forces am I committing to this thing? And then how sure am I that it's going to come off, right? And we saw this in the game at BGF last year of Smolensk, where the Germans attack what looks like city held by a couple divisions of Soviets, not knowing there's a 4 action rating NKVD unit in there, and suddenly that German attack is not nearly as favorable as they think. And I say this having been the unfortunate fucker that has rolled on like 25 attacks, has rolled like 12 defender surprises. Okay, literally this happened last year at Winterfest. The number of defender surprises that I rolled as the attacker was fucking staggering. Okay. It's kind of built that way. I like that. That adds uncertainty to every combat. It reflects the fog of war and enhances that fog of war rule without that uncertainty being entirely dependent on fog of war, which is never perfectly implemented in a war game, right? Because you just attacked that stack last turn. You didn't see him move anything, so it's the same number of factors that he had. This is, I think, one of the core things of OCS. Now, saying you don't like that is a completely fair statement. And as Doug points out, AR separates unit quality from the TO&E, and that's absolutely true. It's a little it's a little bit of an oversimplification to to say that AR reflects unit quality. It's a bunch of intangibles and soft factors, including training and doctrine and all kinds of stuff. But in aggregate, yes, it effectively represents troop quality. And yes, Doug, we would all love to see the next whiff videos. Thank you. Anytime now. Um, yep, good point. Cedar Mountain was not a shining moment for Stonewall Jackson. He should have wrecked the Union force instead of won a hard fought battle. Absolutely. This is essentially of how it works. There have been other attempts to implement this. An interesting one that I haven't tried yet that I want to get to sometime fairly soon is in the Eagles of France series from Hexasim. It's not written orders, but you like have orders, you need to commit to them. That is to some extent reflected in GBACW as well. But the orders are restricted to a few different types, and it does not generally feel very restrictive. Sometimes it is, but not always. Where in like line of battle, you could be absolutely hamstrung by your orders. So, Brant from the Armchair Dragoons, thanks for stopping by. Pointing out that they finished the Connections online planning meeting for this week. If you want to be involved in the Connections conference, go check it out at the Armchair Dragoons website. There's a link to that in the video description. So, I suspect that Doug may be working on some Gauss instructional stuff since we've just played a week of 15-hour days playing it. So we're probably as well positioned as basically anybody, other than maybe Joe and Doug, of producing those videos at this point. They will not be coming from me, but there will be an after action report video that is probably next week. Is probably when that's coming. Awesome. We are riveted to the edge of our screens. All right, there is a crap load of comments that I'm trying to get through here. Uh, John C points out that Jackson fell asleep on the job during the 7 days. Like I said, fairly erratic and inconsistent. Now I have not played Burma. I would like to play Burma, where you have, I believe, mules that can be used to transport supply, or you can eat the mules, which is kind of awesome, actually. There you go. Doug has the. If you're not already subscribed to the Tabletop's Edge, please rectify that error on your part. I will point that out. Anyway, next up, back to Stonewall Jackson. Strangely enough, Stonewall Jackson's Way. This is a. I'm lost in my own list. This I didn't put it on the list. That's why. Damn it. This is what 1988. That sounds right. Joe Balkowski designed from Avalon Hill. This, of course, is the first game in the great campaigns of the American Civil War system. And while it is not quite the same sort of pulsed movement that you get in the Civil War, it's not. I think that's an influence. This is a. It's not just I go, you go. What it may end up being is I go, you go again, you go again, you go some more, you go again, you go again. I still don't go. You go again. And then I go. And that can totally happen. That is one of the joys of this system. Totally a reason why some people don't like it. But essentially it's a really elegant system. There are points of inelegance about this system too, like all the various conditions that can accrete onto a unit, which is a bit clumsy. But the basic and incredibly elegant and beautiful thing here is that, okay, we are conducting an activation. We will roll the dice. I have gotten higher. I will activate. You have gotten higher. You will activate. And then when I'm done or you're done, we roll again. And that's it. And if you both pass, then the turn's over. It is incredibly simple, incredibly elegant. And because in this game, Confederates win all ties on that roll, it effectively reflects and simulates the command superiority of the Confederates in this campaign, which is Second Bull Run, by the way. If you have Stonewall Jackson's Way 2 from MMP, then that also includes an entire module for the first Bull Run campaign as well, called All Green Alike. This is a great system. It's one of my favorite systems. It is one of a very small number of systems that I have gone out of my way to get everything. And I have everything. I have all the games, all the skirmishers. I have all the magazines, the generals that have this stuff in it. I've got everything. I don't have everything for OCS, but I have all the games at least. Burma is very much the odd duck of OCS, but a lot of people really love Burma too. There's at least one, there's at least two actually, OCS and the Pacific things in the development pipeline, one of which is Luzon, which is probably going to be in Operational Matters number 2, and which is pretty well along. I mean, basically done. I think they just need articles for the magazine at this point. So I have recommended this highly, and which reminds me, I got a video to edit on this. I have been recommending this highly for years. Like I said, it's one of my favorite systems. It is a brilliant design. I think it is an awful shame that Joe Balkowski stepped away from Wargaming design, and I am delighted that he is back. So we can get Joe Balkowski goodness, and right now the avenue for doing that is GCACW. This system is also a system that in, say, the last 10 years has really taken off. And that's why MMP seems to be supportive of it to a degree that you might find surprising, considering that it's not ASL. Next up is another one from DNASIC, Guderian's Blitzkrieg. This is the first OCS game. Now, there's a couple of things to note here. One is that this is the only OCS game that you cannot play with the current rules. It would just be broken. And one of the big reasons for that is that the supply dynamic is completely different. Imagine, if you will, if you've played OCS and not played the first Guderian's Blitzkrieg, OCS without trace supply. Everybody eats off the map, and each turn you get 140 supply or whatever the number is, right? That's completely different from the way it works now. It's a lot more points management. I nevertheless grabbed it and actually would like to try it, but I have no expectation of playing it with the current rules either. Obviously, this has been a super influential design. If you ask Dean, he is, and I know this because he wrote an article about this, what his innovation that he felt was most important in OCS, it is the surprise mechanic and not the way you track supply. There are antecedents of the supply mechanic elsewhere in war games prior to this. Europa, for example, has an attack supply mechanic that I may have been around at this. I'm not sure about this, but it may have been around at this point. That feels like a very very ungranular and kludgy OCS supply system. Supply Lines of the American Revolution, highly recommended, by the way. It's pretty great. I mean, logistics are they important? Yes. Should they generally be abstracted? Yes. They are always abstracted, right? In everything, including in Supply Lines of the American Revolution and other games that say they are about logistics, including Quartermaster General, for example, which is literally named after the quartermaster. And which is also very good, by the way. But I think you really want the 6 people or 5 people or whatever it is to play Quartermaster General, in my opinion. You could play it 3-handed, and it's no, not really. You could play it 4-handed. I suppose that would work. But it's much better. It's a much better game with 6 players. This is true. This is true. You can ask Berthier about this. That's totally a thing that would happen. This is also true. I want to say Guderian's Blitzkrieg comes out before Typhoon, which is the first EFS game. Guderian's Blitzkrieg is 1992. I'm going to look this up. It is 1995. Now, there are precedents for this, right? One of the interesting precedents is Edelweiss. Now, I want to, that's why I picked Edelweiss up, because it looks like the best and most interesting game in that series, which has some very OC, it predates OCS, and which has some very OCS looking things in it. So I really kind of want to fiddle with that system and see what it does. It may have been it might have been the Desert Games that brought this in, because I mean it's important there, right? But the fact is, it's like, okay, it's really coarse. It's like I can like put I could like have a combat using 10 REs with one supply point. But I got 11 REs and I need 11 REs, so I got to spend 2 supply points. And then there are many turns where I will get no supply points, and then other turns where supply points are coming over and the boat sinks. So and that's kind of in keeping with the campaign. But it's even more frustrating than if you just fueled. I mean, I'd be fine saying I got 11 REs going in. I'll pay 11 supply points, right? And then I can ship over, 3 boats with 5 supply points each or whatever, and maybe some of them sink, and that's cool. This is Stigler. This you have just described BCS. Actually, this is literally what you do. You literally roll a die, and if the petrol shows up, then you rolled good, and if the petrol doesn't show up, then you rolled less good. And it's beautiful. It works great. It simulates the decision making part of the commander's decision cycle, where they've got to be concerned about their logistical tail. You don't have to manage points or anything like that, but you really want to make sure that you have secure line of communication to the rear, and supply, and aren't crossing, if you will, crossing the streams with a bunch of other formations, supply clogging up the roads behind you. It's just a die roll and some DRM, so you don't have to deal with any of that, and that is fantastic. Tim Greenaw says, what's a good BCS game to start with? Really, any of them. However, the Tabletop's Edge says Aerocore, and I agree with that for a couple of reasons. One, it is very manageable, and one reservation. It is very manageable. It is relatively small. You will not become overwhelmed by Aerocore, and you can play it in a weekend to completion, the campaign. It is relatively inexpensive for an MMP product of its size. I believe it's 2 counter sheets and a map, something like that. 1 map, but it might have been 2 counter sheets or a counter sheet and a half. It has bigger counters. It has 5/8 inch counters. That's awfully nice. The reservation is the mandatory fatigue rule, the mandatory recovery rule, which may, if you start with Aerocore and really learn Aerocore, may give you a false sense of tempo when you then move to another BCS game. So just be careful about that. That is not a rule that is appearing in any other BCS game at this point. And essentially the way it works is if you're at Fatigue 4, you have to do a recovery activation. You can't attempt to actually activate. And if you're at Fat 3, I think you can attempt to activate. But if you do, you're automatically fatigued and go to Fatigue 4, something like that. So, and bear in mind, some units will start the game fatigued, right? It's beautiful, guys. It's beautiful. Okay. Perfidious Albion says logistics during the Napoleonic period was based initially on the wagon train, but at some point the troops had to feed off the land. Hence, this was disastrous during the Russian campaign. Yes, this is absolutely true. And by living off the land, we don't necessarily mean the troops were out picking roots and berries. We mean that they were pillaging and taking the food from the local farmers. Just to be clear on that. But the Russians, it was scorched earth, right? So yes, but the mistake Napoleon made was doing it in the first place. So, as was the case with a number of Napoleon's big mistakes, like the Peninsular War, that was his fault. He shat his pants on that. What are you going to say? All right, next up is Battle Cry. This is an Avalon Hill game from Richard Borg. I looked to see if this was Richard Borg's first design, and it was not. But it is his first war game that I think a lot of people will know about. This is the genesis of the commands and colors system. And there's probably a kernel of truth in 'cause the joke that was running through my mind was, has Richard Bork designed any other games? I wanted to see if he had, right? Because so much of what he has done in recent years has been commands and colors this and commands and colors that. That's not a slap, by the way. Generally speaking, I think the commands and colors games are outstanding. I've never played Battle Cry. It's Civil War. It's got little plastic soldiers instead of blocks. I'd prefer the blocks. I don't want to deal with the little plastic soldiers with their broken off rifles and stuff. But the did I will answer that question in a minute. I would rather deal with the blocks in a commands and colors game than little tiny miniatures. And that's not just me being fussy or trying to be funny about not wanting to play miniatures. That's me just not wanting to deal with it. I like the blocks. I think the blocks are aesthetically pleasing. I think they give you the effect of having miniatures without having to deal with any of the problems of having miniatures. Um, Jeff Beeler says, surprised that Labatai is not on the list. I don't think that Labatai is a transformative war game. On the other hand, if I were to have put it on the list, it would have been La Bataille de la Moscova, which comes out around 1974, 74, 75, something like that, from Marshall Enterprises. I think it's picked up very quickly by GDW and redone in a somewhat nicer format, as far as I can tell. It's not the first monster game. Sometimes people say it is, but it's not. I think it is the first tactical monster game on a battle. And that might be significant, depending on who you talk to. Otherwise, I don't know that I think that La Bataille. I think the things that La Bataille are influential for extend beyond the La Bataille games as such, right? There's that sort of La Bataille look, but that's not the La Bataille look. That's the Rick Barber look, right? And is shared across a number of Rick Barber games. So no, La Bataille is not on this list. But if I was going to put it on this list, and it's not a bad idea, and I'm not actually saying it doesn't deserve to be, if I was going to, it would have been the original La Bataille de la Moscova. Eric Hansen also recommends introing yourself to BCS with Ericor, as do I. So with, like I said, I have that one reservation about it, but just watch for that. And once you get used to it, if you know it's there, you know that when you move to last Blitzkrieg or whatever. Now, the other recommendation I will make is, I don't care which BCS game you play, use the current rules, not the rules that came in the box if that's not BCS 2 point whatever. The new rules are cleaner, they're better structured, they are clearer, and there are some relatively minor changes that have a significant effect on play. So absolutely play with the new rules. The other thing is that the first two games, Last Blitzkrieg and Baptism by Fire, do not have the identifying colored stripes on the counters. Now, if you were colorblind, they might not have helped you anyway, but I'm not colorblind, at least not very colorblind, and it helps me a lot. I have occasionally, I think once or twice, it's a kind of a miracle, it's only been that, in Last Blitzkrieg, accidentally moved somebody from Piper when I meant to be moving First SS, or accidentally moved 12th SS when I meant to be moving First SS, or whatever. So that's a thing that happens. Watch out for it. But I don't know why they didn't include the formation stripes on the game in the first place. They brought that in with Brazen Chariots, which is also outstanding, by the way. Next up, Twilight Struggle. I don't think we can deny. I mentioned this on the new classics, and I don't think we can deny that this has been super influential. It has, I think, brought some people into war games. I don't think this is quite as big a deal as some people have made it out to be. But it has also, I think, been influential in the design space. Whether you think this is a real war game or not, it has influenced games that are real war games. So I think it's significant for that reason. Jim Greenwell, we have already determined whether it is a war game or not, so I'm not going to answer that here tonight. So that is not the question I am here to answer tonight, right? But in any case, right, this by itself, just being number one on BGG was like a Forbes level news, right? And it was there for a long time. So just the prominence of Twilight Struggle brought more attention to war games. You did not miss Paths of Glory, actually. Um, am I out of order? I'm out of order. That's the problem. That's the one that's out of order. Okay. Um, so the prominence of this, I don't think that like directly bringing new wargamers in has happened to nearly the extent that people think it has, but I think it has happened. And it has brought greater awareness that there is a thing out here called war games, and that whether those people have played Twilight Struggle or not may have brought more people into war games. um is Freedom Underground Railroad a war game? It's an excellent game, but no, I don't think so. I don't think it's a war game or a conflict simulation. Let me put it that way. Perfidious Albion, we have already answered definitively whether Twilight Struggle is a war game or not, so we're not going to talk about that again today. So next up is the game that should have been before, a couple games ago, actually. We the People. This is a Mark Herman design, and whenever you do these lists, you end up with, boy, I got 15 Mark Herman games on this list. Damn it! I gotta get somebody else in here too. And Mark doesn't totally dominate this list, but this is the one that I think where you have to point. Now, this is the genesis of the CDG mechanic. Now, it's not really quite fully realized here in We the People. Now, this, of course, is available now from I'm not sure if it's in print, but relatively recently anyway, available from GMT in a reprinted version, redone version called Washington's War, which is, basically the same game. I think there's some relatively modest changes. I like this a lot less than I like For the People. And I think it's in For the People where the card driven mechanic really comes into its to the full flowering of the CDG mechanic. And it's that game, For the People, from which a lot of other CDG models have arisen. On the other hand, there's some games that go right back to We the People, like Europe. What's that Europe game called from Worthington Games that I actually liked, that you could play in 2 hours. That kind of harkens more back to this than to For the People, where something like Paths of Glory harkens more back to For the People. And I wasn't going to put the I wasn't going to put. Added a couple of extra slides manually to the slideshow after the fact, and I'm sure that's why they got out of order. Um, the the ultimate genesis of the CDG mechanic, however, is here. Now, again, it's not like there were never cards before. There are a number of SPI games, mostly science fiction and fantasy games, thinking about it, that used cards, but not in the CDG way. And I need to watch that Narvik thing on Netflix, by the way, Andrew Atkin. Thanks for stopping by. So John C says Washington's War is on the P500 reprint list, so it's out of print. Well, I have it, so sorry. But it's excellent. I like For the People better. I'm more interested in the Civil War than the Revolutionary War. That's got to be part of it. But that CDG mechanisms are more fully formed in. They are fully formed in For the People. And they're still in a little bit inchoate in We the People. I may or may not have pronounced that correctly. 1776 did have cards, that's true, but again, this is where that mechanic comes from. And we could, kind of follow the CDG Yellow Brick Road down to the City of Oz to meet the wizard, and that's not a bad show idea either. Best CDGs. Um, in that conversation, then something like Paths of Glory, which has in turn influenced a bunch of other things. I think that yeah, that's a topic we could get to. But in the meantime, the big influence, I think, begins here with We the People, continues with Mark through For the People, and then spreads to Ted Racer and a bunch of other folks doing games on this idea. Stuka Joe says that the separate decks in Paths of Glory took CDGs to a higher level. And that's one of the significant differences between Paths of Glory and the Mark Herman CDGs, like For the People and Empire of the Sun specifically, is the sort of deck staging. that you have separate decks for the two powers, although you have separate decks for the two powers in Empire of the Sun. Um, but not only that, but you separate them into eras. So you have early era, middle era, and late era. And that very much changes the deck dynamic. And that is, did I would imagine Paths of Glory came out before Twilight Struggle, but I didn't look Paths of Glory up, so I don't know that for sure. John wonders the same thing if Paths of Glory was the first game that had separate decks. That's very common in a large number of other CDGs at this point. And it may have been, but I don't know that it is without researching it. Next up is Israeli Independence, the First Arab-Israeli War. This is a game by Darren Leveloff, released in 2008 from Victory Point Games. Now, I think if you've looked at the map, and folks will recognize what this is the first States of Siege game. Now, States of Siege has, hasn't been around that long. It's been around 14 years, so not nearly as long as We the People, which has been around like an extra 10 years or something like that. Is that right? Almost 20. But it has really taken off as a mechanism specifically for solitaire play, and there's a bunch of variations on it that we now see a fair amount of, right? Variations on the States of Siege system. So I've heard this described as tower defense. I've never played a tower defense video game, so I don't know how accurate this is. But essentially, you have a central pole that you must protect. In this case, presumably it's Jerusalem. If you're playing Soviet Dawn, it's Moscow. And you have a bunch of tracks that are gradually constricting against you. And if any of the tracks reaches the central pole, you lose. And then you have a number of tools by which to fight the advancement on those tracks. And then there is some kind of mechanism whereby the tracks advance. This has been an incredibly fruitful design space. Darren Leveloff has done a number of other games. Ben Madison has done a bunch in this space, including the very clever The Mission, which is kind of like a States of Siege plus an inverted States of Siege, where you start as the apostles and you have to spread Christianity throughout the world, and then the tracks begin to constrict on you. It's really quite neat, and I believe that the first Jihad is something similar, where you're working to expand on tracks rather than the tracks are constricting in on you. So really interesting basic mechanism that there are now dozens of, maybe even 100 games based on this States of Siege mechanic. I don't know that. So We the People is definitely before Paths of Glory. I'm not sure anybody suggested that, but Twilight Struggle is 2005. So Stuka Joe says it's 1999. That makes sense. And I like Paths of Glory a lot more than I like Twilight Struggle, frankly. But they both do have some there are some similarities in there, other than just the decks and the three stages, right? Everybody's playing out of the same deck in Twilight Struggle, though. Trying to parse the comments here. William Aaron's points out that the Labatai series are at least a pinnacle of Napoleonic wargaming. If those who have not yet attempted to climb it can one day. Yeah, but bear in mind, you have to be interested in tactical. And not only interested, you have to be very interested in tactical, right? Because it's very tactical. There are people who just aren't interested in that simulating that scale, right? And I completely understand that. Those who might prefer the Napoleonic Brigade series from the Gamers, or the Eagles of France series, which is regimental, those are easier to deal with. Also, I'm not going to lie, there are some handling challenges in Labatai that other games don't have, where you got to get vitally needed information off the backs of the counter. That's not super desirable. Somebody asked about Empires in Arms. And Empires in Arms is one of those games that is not on this list because I don't think it's transformative. There's still nothing really like Empires in Arms. What is it most similar to? Diplomacy, I suppose. But it's like a diplomacy with a real system bolted into it. There's really nothing quite like Empires in Arms. Um, Cosmic Encounter, maybe, but Cosmic Encounter, I'm pretty sure predates Empires in Arms. I'm pretty sure. Um, so that's why Empires in Arms isn't on the list. Labyrinth, War on Terror. This is a 2010 release by Volko Ruhnke, and this is where. So I was kind of floating between this and Wilderness War, and I think the Volko innovations are much clearer in Labyrinth than they were in Wilderness War. This is the game that is the ultimate genesis of the Coin series, which we will mention in a second. Um, there hasn't been really a lot of emulation of Labyrinth, but you can absolutely see the sort of progression in. We have this card driven game, right? Here's Twilight Struggle, here's Labyrinth, which takes it to a different level. And then here's Coin, which uses some of the same ideas from the other two, but then blends them, but then takes them off in yet another new direction. So very interesting. Dan the Dancing Man is here tonight. Welcome, Moose Man. The Transform. Oh, yeah, that's good call. Good call. No, I didn't think to put it. So, on the one hand, I think it's worth talking about the area impulse games, and they probably shouldn't have a place on this list, but they probably should have a place on this list, so that I'm being clear. But how do you have that conversation? Because it's not like they invented area movement, right? They didn't. There's other mechanical things going on in those games that we call area impulse games, other than just the fact that they're area maps and not hex maps. And I don't feel like I have a good enough grasp on that to actually say, because as we discussed in the Unplayed Classics video, then I have not played an area impulse game. For clarity, I'm not calling Labyrinth a coin game. I'm saying that one can see a progression of idea from Twilight Struggle to Labyrinth to our next game, Andean Abyss. Labyrinth is definitively not a coin game. Nobody said that it is. So obviously this is the last game on the list. Everything else on the list is on the too soon to say list, which we'll cover very briefly in a minute. It is an ancestor of the coin series, though. It's the same designer. You could see the progression of ideas. I'm not sure I understand what we're saying here. I mean, Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising, yeah, okay, but that mechanic just being an area movement, I don't think is a transformative thing. We've seen that since the early 70s, at least. Well, the reason the area impulse game, let me state that state the reason why the area impulse games are not on here more clearly. They're not on here because I don't sufficiently understand them, not having played any of them. So that's really why they're not on my list. Do they deserve to be? Yeah, I think they probably are. And that's certainly a Risk is area movement. That's dates from the 50s, I believe. So yeah, Britannia or Kingmaker, good point. There we go. And that's Courtney Allen. Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing if we can locate Mr. Allen. Anyway, I don't need to convince anybody that coin has been super influential. This is another one where I think it's had influence. The coin ideas have had influence outside of coin. There are also coin-alikes that I will say, like games like Root, I think is a coin-alike. I wouldn't call it a coin game because it's not, but it's a coin-alike. The Expanse board game by Jeff Engelstein is a coin-alike. It sounds like The Troubles coming from Compass looks pretty neat, by the way. That looks like a coin-alike. Werewolf from Legion Wargames, that looks like a coin-alike. So we're seeing a lot of work in this space. Andean Abyss is the first of the coin games. Some of those other things don't necessarily borrow the entire model. They borrow bits and pieces of the model. But boy, that's good. But obviously super duper influential. Now, are they war games? I think some of them clearly are. I think some of them, equally clearly aren't. But they're all conflict simulations, and maybe depending on where you how much you care about that definition, maybe you care about the semantics of it. But I think some of them are war games and some of them aren't. But in any case, they've been very influential in the war game space. So that's the list. That's my list of transformative war games. Again, I said right at the top of the show, I was not going to catch everything, and I haven't. And there's a couple good ideas in here. La Bataille de la Moskva. Yeah, I could see putting that in. At one of the area impulse games. And again, that's not here because I couldn't explain the mechanic, right? Other than the scenario map. That's it. So so that's why I left it out. But you don't need a group to play, but they play much better with four people. I have to admit that. It would have been better to bring in some like air or naval games, as Farshad Niazi points out. That would have been a good point. I don't have as much experience with that stuff, but we did get flat top, so it's not like there's none. Tabletop Sedge, I did mention Empires of the Middle Ages, and I left it out because it's like Empires in Arms. It's kind of a game that nobody else has tried to emulate or outreach. But I mean, I don't think again, I'm not sure how transformative it has been. Is it a really important and extraordinarily clever game? Yeah, absolutely. Same deal with Empires in Arms. But it's a lot harder to nail down its influence. If Empires in Arms has a closest equivalent, it is probably Napoleon's Imperium from Andrew Rowland and Compass. I think there are folks who picked up Napoleon's Imperium and were disappointed that it was not a simulation of the Napoleonic period. It is not. It is much more an experience along the lines of Empires in Arms without necessarily diplomacy that's quite that hairy. There are nevertheless a couple of games that have come out in the last 5 years that I think are potentially could be as influential as the games on the rest of the list. I could have mentioned Axis and Allies. True. That's a fair point. Leaving that off is a fair point. Thank you, Dan. You're a creep. First on that list is Last Blitzkrieg. This is BCS, the Battalion Combat Series from Dean Essig. The activation mechanism as affected in BCS is really extraordinary, and I think we are going to see a lot of, or maybe we'll see. I think we may start to see a lot of designers try and incorporate these ideas. Again, these things don't arise, from vacuum. It's in some ways very similar to the chit pull mechanism that we've seen before. It's not a chit pull. Don't use chit pull. It's an option. Don't use it. It's in some ways similar to the pulsed activation system from Civil War or GCACW. But it's different. So it's a new take on the individual formation activation, such that it's I go, you go, but I go, and it didn't take me an hour to go, right? I might take 3 or 4 minutes to do an activation. I might take 20, but then it's an activation where shit's happening. Another thing that might end up being super duper influential is Nevsky. Now, if you looked at it right now and the number of Levian campaign games that are in the pipeline, you might say, oh yeah, it's definitely should be on the list. And I don't know. I mean, we've only got 3 Levian campaign games actually out, right? These things could bomb. I don't know. I don't think so. They look good to me, but we don't really know yet how that's all going to shake out. I can tell you that there is a vibrant Levian campaign design community happening. There's a big Discord community, and there's at least 20 or 30 different Levian campaign games in development in various stages of development. I am positive that not all of them will actually turn into finished games, but a bunch of them probably will. And in the meantime, where some are sitting around, some new ones will come up. There's going to be a huge presence of Levian campaign at the upcoming virtual San Diego HistCon thing in March. When is that? That is March 18th, I think. I could be wrong. Go check the SD HistCon site. Don't take my word for it. Or go check the Wargaming events calendar linked in the video description over on the Amateur Dragoon site. So again, jury's out on this. We'll see, but I think Nevsky is pretty well positioned and Levian campaign more broadly, is pretty well positioned to have a lot of influence. We'll see how it works out. Lastly, Atlantic Chase. This is on the list for the basic mechanics in here are I think very clever. But it's really here for the presentation. The presentation is revolutionary. Whether it's revolutionary in a way that can be more broadly adopted by war games is completely up in the air. It is a completely different way to approach presenting a war game and teaching a war game with the stuff that you get in the box. And it may end up being tremendously influential for that reason. The sort of trajectory mechanic is also very interesting. That may end up being influential too, but that's hard. I think that's even harder to say. I think the obvious thing is you look at the box, you open up your new copy of Atlantic Chase, and you start looking at the materials, and you're like, wow, this is something else. I mean, just looking at the presentation, it's like, wow, this is something else. It is amazing in terms of presentation. There are reservations about the game in some quarters, and I think those reservations are not entirely ill-founded. I am personally very fond of hunting for what was called very cleverly, I thought, Schrodinger's convoy. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. It's in an indeterminate state until the wave function collapses. So there's that, but there's no question about the presentation. It's simply just amazing. John C, I don't think that's transformative. I think it's just really, really good. It's a really well-written, well-assembled, and well-structured rule book. I don't think it's transformative. I think Bruce just did an awesome job. And if more people would do that, that would be great. And I would love to come back to this topic in 2 years and say everybody is writing rule books like Bruce Maxwell now. No one will be happier than I. Mo heard there were issues with Absolute Wars rules. They were confusing and not well laid out. I'm not sure I've heard that about Absolute War, but I have heard that about Hitler's Reich, which was apparently not well received in terms of rule structure. So I haven't really looked at Absolute War. It does not seem to be my kind of thing, so I didn't bother investigating it particularly closely. Clark Commando 1983. Welcome, Mark. Thanks for stopping by. Atlantic Chase. It really is. It's the rule book. It's kind of the whole package with the player aids and the scenarios and the way they're structured, and it's really something else. Dan is creeping on everybody in the chat tonight. Yes, and it has received a rewritten rule book. To what extent that fixes the problem, I can't tell you. Now, my first Jerry White game was the Enemy Coast Ahead, the Dam Buster raid. And that's really well presented too, and I think very clever. And I think some of the ideas in there in terms of presentation are on the same chain that leads to Atlantic Chase, right? So if GMT was going to, or whoever, right? Boy, it'd be fabulous if MMP would actually hire an employee. That'd be cool. If some wargaming company were to say, we're hiring somebody who is going to be our lead developer in charge of overall presentation, not rules development. There's going to be like a rules developer to handle the play testing and all that, the rules writing and all that stuff. But to just handle like the touch and feel playability of our games, I would immediately nominate Jerry White for that position, based on what we have seen thus far. So, no, not really. I mean, Ticket to Ride's it uses the little sticks, and that's fine. But I mean, I don't know. I think that's a bit of a fatuous comparison, Peter Fulford. Thank you for coming. This is a great point. Yeah, but where do you pinpoint the transformation here, right? Do you this is another one where this something on this chain, one of the links on this chain could have easily made this list, and I should have done that, but I'm not going to catch everything, and I'm already running late. Where do you pinpoint that transformative element? Do you pinpoint it at the beginning with B-17 Queen of the Sky, or try to find predecessor games to that, and there may be some. Or do you say, fuck it, give it to Greg? I mean, I'd be pretty okay giving it to Greg, actually. I think it would be fair to say that Greg revitalized that genre, right? And turned it into something just as vibrant as, say, States of Siege, which did make the list. So in that context, although B-17 was a classic that folks knew about, thank you, Stuka Joe, nobody was really doing anything in that design space until Greg came along. At least not much. I'm happy to be corrected on that. So anyway, there we go. There we go. And it's the hunters that I'm talking about, by the way, when we decide we're going to pin the tail on Greg for that one. That's kind of the game that, and now we're seeing tons of other games, of that type, right? Including, a World War I clone of the Hunters from Compass, Raiders of the Deep. We've seen, folks going back to the original idea, including Greg, but not limited to Greg, with games like Target for Tonight and Target for Today, from Legion Wargames, which are both like excellent B-17 on steroids with more planes. If you really love that system, those are the games you should check out. States of Siege, the First World War. So are we talking about the thing that was from Mayfair here? Let me pull this up. I assume we're talking about this thing. I've never played this. It is a Ted Racer World War I game, which has, there's plenty of reasons to play Ted Racer World War I games, right? But this is not one that I have looked at. The microphone is directly between me and this image. So if the sound sounds weird, that's why. So yeah, this isn't something I've really looked at. This isn't something that I am especially aware of. I would be very interested to learn more about this, however. This doesn't quite look like quite the same thing, in that there are there are tracks, but you're kind of progressing through these different zones along these tracks, which reflect the flow of battle, if you will. So this does kind of smell like a predecessor of States of Siege, though. And again, none of these ideas just came out of nowhere, right? Just standing on the shoulders of giants, and so forth. So, Brian Gash mentions Ambush, maybe. And this is another one that's like, yeah, there's not really that many people have emulated this, to be honest. Mark Hodgkinson says that those are done as fronts and not like States of Siege. So that reminds me, therefore, of, I think earlier than that, of Ted's Great War in Europe, which I have played in the original Command Magazine version. And that did the same thing. That broke up Europe into hex maps of, here's the West Front, here's the East Front, here's the Italian Front. And then there was a later Great War in the Near East that brought that to, the Ottoman Empire as well. So yeah, check out Callendale's review of that. That might be cool. And hey, I give well, sometimes when this happens, you're just pleasantly surprised. I'm just saying, were that to occur, there'll be a guest appearance in a game coming near you. Not Greg Smith's game though. So all right, folks, what do we got coming up? So this week, there are 4 additional things being released this week. Tuesday, tomorrow, is the Stream with Dan. It is here. We have not picked the topic yet because we never do that until 2 minutes before the show. Wednesday, we will see the OCS Ostfront After Action Report starring Chip Saltzman, who has now been named, brand new news here. Chip has been named by Dean as the OCS Series Honcho. Chip is extraordinarily capable and eloquent. He will do a fabulous, and he's been helping out with this for a long time. So I have extremely complete confidence that Chip will do an amazing job as OCS Series Honcho. So congratulations to Chip Saltzman on that. Chip will be guest starring in our OCS Ostfront After Action Report, which will be debuting on Wednesday. Thursday, we have an unboxing, a buddy unboxing with the buddy. He's not on camera. He's camera shy and didn't want to be on camera, but his voice can be heard in the unboxing, of course, on Pocket 2 from Jack Rady and Pacific Rim Publishing. And on Friday, we have a new, and I've sort of mentioned I was going to do this, Wargaming Storage Series video. Subject of that, you're going to have to watch the video to see the Wargaming storage solution is the cinder block that is the Third World War for Frank Chadwick and Compass Games. And then we're going to try and put that back on the shelf. It literally weighs as much as a cinder block now. So hopefully everybody has enjoyed this. Next week's show topic is best SBI soapboxes. So I will announce that in advance. The topic of the week after that is the topic that I talked myself out of in the course of doing this show. So next week will be best SBI soapboxes with a couple honorable mentions of games that could have been in soapbox because they were big enough, but they didn't have soapboxes. This is that would be actually a good topic. I would want co-hosts for that. I've always been reluctant to do a show that boils down to, and now we'll talk about games that suck. And that's not what you're saying here, but this is a great show topic, and I don't know that I want it to as a topic for this show. Let me put it that way. I would be delighted to be on a panel discussing that, however, so that we could talk about, no, it's just all loose. I just stuff the counters in the box. You'll see it when you see the video. So it is by far the most elaborate storage solution I have thus far created. Will not be the most ever, but it is pretty elaborate. So folks, I am out of time here. So I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please do remember to give the video a thumbs up if you have not already. Please subscribe to the channel if you are not already. If you would like to help support the channel, there is the Patreon, which is the best way to do that. Other bennies accrue to Patreon supporters as well. Shout outs to our new patrons as well. So thanks to everybody. Coruscant Pocket 2 is making its debut on the channel on Thursday. And then this is all uploaded and everything. So you don't have to worry about me shitting the bed. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming. We had spectacularly good numbers here tonight. We topped out at 175. So that's a really great number for me doing zero work to promote the episode. So thanks everybody. We'll see you all again next week. Tune in tomorrow with Dan at 7:30 Eastern over here on this channel.